Today I'd like to discuss the United States and more specifically their central government, because this country has, for the past couple of years, been the focus of international gossip probably more than any other time in history. Following its rise to the seat of international leadership succeeding the events of World War II, and after the events of the Cold War throughout the latter half of the 20th century, the United States has long been considered the world's only remaining superpower, which is a term originally derived from the strength of a nation's military. But beyond its military, the United States has boasted the world's largest economy since the late 19th century, and for decades leading up to the information revolution, its multicultural impact on global society is beyond compare. Now, despite being the world's most powerful country for over the past century, the United States is in fact an infant in many cases amongst the ancient histories of other nations. The question that I'd like to pose in this recording, simply put, is why are people all around the world still immigrating to the United States? Now, modern data shows that the U.S. accepts more immigrants than any other country in the world, and it hosts the greatest number of international students of any country by far. The data is conclusive. People want to live in the United States, and the question is, why? Unlike most Americans today, I'm not going to attribute the current state of affairs to the actions of one man, for the current president in the present day is being accredited for seemingly all of the country's failures and its successes. This is a culture of obsession and fear, counterproductive for its people, and a true side effect of the right versus left paradigm, so instrumental in the ongoing distraction of peoples worldwide, but especially within the United States. Now, I am not a historian. I'm not a historian because, as is often inquired, what is history but a fable not yet agreed upon? History is an accounting of memory, and as we all know, memory is not a reliable recounting of past events, because human beings, so fallible as they already are, always have individual memories, even within groups of otherwise reliable witnesses experiencing the same events at the same time. This is a well-documented fact, and I could never fully express the importance, especially whilst living in the information age, of reserving your own view and recollection of past events until after researching a diverse pool of conflicting historical views. How many of us, for example, were educated by the American school system in the interactions of the early Americans and the indigenous North American tribes from the perspective of the Navajo, the Cherokee, or the Sioux? Now, for younger listeners born in the 1990s or in the early 2000s, I may appear as redundant or stand guilty of stating the obvious when I say that countries, in and of themselves, are imaginary or ideological and not a physical reality. When viewed from outer space, there are no discernible countries and no visible artificial lines separating nations carved out of the landmasses on this terrestrial globe. There are no discernible genes or characteristics in form between Mexicans or Canadians residing on one side of an imaginary line compared to Americans on the other. And yet, without these so-called borders, there can be no country. The head of the United States government, the most distinguished country on earth, just clarified that for us in his speech yesterday discussing immigration.
Without a border, you don't have a country. You don't have a country.
Now, before I go any further, I would like to clarify that I am not anti-American. I believe that being anti-American or anti-China, anti-India, Canada, Russia, North Korea, anti-any country is to be anti-human. But in answering the original question posed in this recording, I've consolidated my thinking into 3 individual reasons, though none of us could ever truly condense such a complicated issue into an explanation that fully or even mostly explains just what the hell is going on here. Because it predates the other causes for immigration, I'll attribute the first reason to the United States Constitution. Children that grow up in the U.S. are, for all intents and purposes, conditioned to worship the Constitution because more than any other idea or body of government, this document is the United States of America. At the time of this recording, the document is 231 years old, and simply put, its foremost function is to delineate the powers of the central government into 3 separate branches, as well as separate the responsibilities of the central government and those of the states, and, perhaps most importantly, to outline a set of inalienable rights for every citizen born to or granted citizenship of the nation. Now, despite the reverence that the Constitution commands worldwide, a minority of Americans have or do read the document, and you can be sure, given its formal, legally scrutinized, and frankly archaic language, that far fewer actually comprehend its meaning. I'm not going to criticize the Constitution here because, honestly, I'm not qualified to. But beyond mere opinion, this document is probably the most meticulously crafted structure of government by some of the most impressive intellectuals in the modern age, and its influence around the world cannot be understated. From my perspective, the Constitution unseated a form of government known best as monarchy, which can best be described as prehistoric, and it effectively defeated that system of government worldwide. Contrary to popular belief, the United States is not a democracy, nor is it a capitalist or free market country. In reality, it defies all of these classifications, but its structure of government, as originally outlined by the Constitution, is more aptly put, a democratic republic, and its economy, as a result, bears the characteristics of capitalism, socialism, and imperialism all in one. These are all words that have broad meanings, and very few Americans could even correctly explain one such classification. But as it's often stated, although the United States is one of the youngest countries in the world, its Constitution is the oldest. That statement pretty well summarizes the influence of this document and the wisdom of its framers. Now, without delving into the present-day political landscape of the U.S. government, the Constitution has still yet to fail the American people. And despite being one of the most corrupt places on earth, one cannot help but admire and respect the structure of the U.S. government, for it's separated not only by federal branches, but also those branches of the state governments, and by the county and the city, and most importantly, by the popular vote. Now, it's essential to remember that if we choose as a people to have a government, that the act of governing is a science, and that those governments we enact to regulate ourselves are individual programs that outlive generations, and they affect our descendants not yet born. Now, because today we have such an elementary understanding of ourselves, it goes without saying that our governments are in need of ongoing improvement and repair. Nevertheless, and despite being over 230 years old, the U.S. Constitution represents the cutting edge of government and to this day protects the freedom of its citizens. The second reason that people all around the world are still immigrating to the United States more than any other country is not one so admirable as the United States Constitution. In short, the reason is wealth, but more specifically, it's wealth accumulated by means of colonialism. Ironic though it may be, considering Americans' origin, that this country has gained the prestige of the world's largest economy, strongest military, and the greatest international influence, both political and cultural, by means of colonialization. It's often stated that the United States has been at war for 222 of its 239 years as an independent nation. That's 93% of its total lifespan. Apart from when it was at war with itself, most of those engagements have been highly profitable exchanges due primarily to the act of colonialization. American colonialism is not limited to the temporary occupation of various nations before, during, and after times of war, but it also predates the United States itself. During the transatlantic slave trade, over 12 million indigenous African people were shipped to the Americas so they could work without pay as slaves until shortly after the United States Congress banned the practice in the year 1860. At the time of their emancipation, the African American slave population had surpassed 4 million. The amount of work done was immeasurable, and the impact on its economic growth incalculable. Much of the nation's infrastructure was built by slaves, including many of the government buildings currently maintained in the nation's capital. Although colonialization of foreign countries has often been beneficiary to those victims of American imperialism, the United States has accrued unprecedented wealth as a result of occupying hundreds of nations throughout its history. In addition to owning the lands currently occupied by its 50 individual states, arguably the richest lands on the face of the earth in terms of the vastness of its natural resources, the U.S. government has imported countless valuable resources from around the globe and concentrated that wealth within its borders. This is a paramount reason, ladies and gentlemen, that so many people for generations have sought residency and citizenship within the United States, because the wealth of its society and the opportunities for personal economic growth available to any member of its workforce are second to none. I'm speaking of the American dream. It's a fantasy of limitless wealth and opportunity, most commonly actualized in one geographical location. This act of colonizing other countries through military occupation is one that is still very much practiced today, disturbingly, to the near complete ignorance of everyday tax-paying Americans. Trump supporters, listen carefully. Mexican immigrants are crossing the border in seek of opportunities. They're doing so because, due to the vast wealth of this country, they can provide for their families far more effectively working a minimum wage job than they can in Mexico. So before you go mentioning your country, how great it is, and how they need to stay out of your borders, you need to consider all of these issues. And most importantly, you need to realize that in more rural areas of Mexico, citizens still refer to the southern half of the West Coast as the North, because before the secession of modern-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, those territories belonged to the Mexican government. They were taken through military force in the mid-19th century. Okay? That was a ruthless invasion and a complete violation of humanitarian rights not afforded to Mexicans in the name of manifest destiny. Look it up, please. Now, the last reason for immigration I'd like to discuss is the unique culture of America. I've been speaking about the American dream, and for all its renown, there's never been an official recounting of what that is or what happens when a person actually achieves the dream. Now, this of course means that the definition of the dream is left to the interpretation of the pursuer, but almost always the American dream is linked to the accumulation of wealth, the acquisition of influence, whether it's a big house, a garage full of expensive cars, or a multi-million-dollar company. American culture largely revolves around the idea of material wealth. But a person can accrue material wealth anywhere around the world, so what is it that makes America the dreaming capital of the world? It should be obvious by now, but it's a combination of the past 2 points I've already made. Nowhere else in the world is there a country so rich in people pursuing wealth, because There is nowhere else in the world that is as wealthy, resulting from hundreds of years of successful American colonialism. But not only that, Americans are extraordinarily free to pursue whatever they want in life, and this is a direct result of the Constitution, and more specifically, the Bill of Rights. Americans have been granted a great many civil rights by the Constitution, but they're also very good about keeping their rights. Since their beginning, American citizens have been very actively involving themselves in the process of governing themselves, and although in the past few decades they may have become stagnant in doing so, with the election of their latest president, we're seeing this activism on an unprecedented scale, especially amongst the youth. Whether it's expressing themselves through speech or assembly, people in the United States are free, for the most part, to say whatever they want. And they've long been proud of the fact that they can walk into the office of any member of Congress or the president and tell them how poorly they've been doing their jobs. It's interesting to see what sort of rights Americans are the most passionate about. For example, the right to, at any point in time, walk into a sporting goods store and walk out 10 minutes later with a shotgun and a rifle in their hands. But even to this day, the prevailing belief in the United States is that the people really do run the government. Their right to bear arms, the Second Amendment of the Constitution, was specifically detailed by the founders to ensure the security of a free state, which of course means that should the government forget who runs the place, the people can remind them by legally overthrowing domestic oppressors and tyrants. America's citizens have hundreds of millions of firearms scattered all throughout the country, and millions to wield them, as a reminder to any would-be invaders or presidents that get any bright ideas about naming themselves king. American culture truly is unique to the world, and although much of it is centered around the acquisition and maintenance of material wealth, a good deal of it is derived from the equal rights and equal opportunities of all its citizens. Although it has very often fallen short of upholding equality for everyone, slavery and racial discrimination has devastated American society since the beginning, there has always been an ongoing effort to make this a reality. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among people, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. I wanted to make this video because the subject of immigration and the correct treatment of illegal immigrants is such a prominent subject matter in the United States today, and more importantly, all around the world. And it's important to remember that no other nation has to face this issue on the scale of the United States, and I believe for the reasons that I just stated. Once again, this work is not meant to be pro-America or anti-America. Illegal immigration is based on the idea of one group of people owning a designated landmass, even if they acquired it by taking the territory by military force from another group. Personally, I believe the ideology a very unhealthy way of thinking, and I also think it's unfair to grant only some of the people residing within a nation's borders unalienable rights, and not all of them, regardless of where they were born. I hope you enjoyed this discussion, and I hope I've helped you to see the political issues of today with a little more clarity and from multiple perspectives. If you enjoy the work I'm doing, follow me on all these different 2018 social media platforms and consider supporting me on Patreon. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next upload.